I want to welcome everybody back. I want to thank Alvin and Jeff for their great jobs as moderators in the breakout sessions. I mostly listen to the technology and innovation one. Jeff, great job. I mean, having 5 panelists and getting through that briskly, everybody participating, just a job well done. And especially liked everybody's feedback to the younger folks, because we do have a lot of current USC students, undergrads and grads that are participating and calling into these things. So great advice from everybody to them. So our next session is going to be moderated by Carl Mount. So Carl mentioned earlier that his power went out where he's at, but the funny part is Carl was on with us 45 minutes prior to the event starting this morning in preparation for the event. And then 2 minutes before he's supposed to speak, the power goes out where he lives. And I had brought up about in Southern California, are we worried about any rolling blackouts because we have a heat wave going on, and what's our backup plan? And we talked about that and stuff. And then he lives in the Northwest and gets the power outage. So anyway, pretty funny story. So anyway, our next plenary panel, Global Food Supply Chain. Carl, take it away.
Hey, thanks, Wink. And I think, so we're having gusts up to like 50 miles an hour up here on the island that I'm living at. So from that standpoint, I'm keeping my fingers crossed to make sure that we don't have anything more go on today. Hopefully everybody's hearing me okay. I'm following along on my iPhone as well to kind of see what the panelists and the audience is seeing as well. So, hey, welcome everyone. It is our pleasure today to have put together just a fantastic panel of food professionals. And I'm going to give them each a chance in just a second to introduce themselves. But first and foremost, I'm Carl Mount. I am the Senior Vice President of Supply Chain Operations for Starbucks. And it's been my pleasure to be a part of the center for the last five or 6 years and be an active participant in each of our annual summits. So thrilled to be with everybody today in a virtual mode. Without further ado, I'm going to put it on to my panelists to give just a couple of minutes each, about a minute each, to introduce themselves and their companies and allow us to understand kind of what they do for their companies and how they fit into the food supply chain. So Grace, let's go ahead and start with you.
Hi. Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Grace Wu. I'm Director of Supply Chain Strategy from McCormick.com. I hope that when you guys are all cooking at home, you're using our products, both McCormick, Frank's, and French's Mustards as well. So my primary function actually for the past couple of months have been in risk management. So COVID has been a very interesting time for me. And I was on the panel last year, and I'm very honored to be invited back.
Thank you. Let's go with Kevin next.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kevin Curry. I am the president of the Southern California division of Albertsons, which consists of 339 stores, either under the Albertsons, Vons, or Pavilions banner. I have 43 years in the grocery retail industry. I'm a proud graduate of the Food Industry Management program in 1990, as well as a proud MBA graduate of the USC Marshall School of Business in 1992. And after 43 years in the industry, I thought I'd seen everything until March 11th and COVID came about. And I sure hope now I've seen everything.
Thank you, Kevin. Let's go on to Carlos.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Carlos Londono. I've been in supply chain for about 25 years. I currently lead the supply chain organization for Chipotle Mexican Grill. Hopefully you guys are eating a lot of Chipotle through this pandemic, because we do a lot of delivery. So many of you have come to me and said, oh, thank goodness for Chipotle that you guys are able to deliver when I'm at home, doing the things that I need to do. So I was also part of the panel last year. So it's a pleasure to be back with Carl and Grace and the rest of the team.
Thanks, Carlos. And I have to admit, I did have Chipotle last night. So I am a frequent user of your products, I have to say.
Thank you, Carl.
Hey, let me pass it over to Uday, and certainly a whole new entrant over the last couple of years into a category for us in food.
Absolutely. Thanks, Carl, for the introduction here. Hi, I'm Uday. I'm the Vice President of Supply Chain for Impossible Foods. We are For those folks who haven't heard of us, we are a plant-based meats company. One of our key customers, of course, includes Carl's company over here, Starbucks, where we introduced our plant-based breakfast sandwich, Impossible Breakfast Sandwich over at Starbucks. As Kevin mentioned, COVID, again, has created quite a bit of, let's just call it turmoil in everything that we have done so far. And I think even Carlos mentioned that. So look forward to participating in this panel. And by the way, this is my first time on the USE panel, the supply chain panel. So appreciate the warm welcome here.
Thank you, Uday. And for all the participants out there, when we put together this panel, we were actually very intentional in saying we want to have different folks represented across the food supply chain. And I flipped over to the next slide, and I just wanted to take just a couple of seconds to familiarize everyone, if you're not familiar with the food supply chain, with what we're really talking about. So as we all know, food is something that each of us has to have every day. So it's actually a supply chain that every single person in the world knows about and touches. It's all about being farm to fork. And whether that farm starts with agricultural products that are either proteins or meats, poultry, or agricultural based and plant, on the other side, it all starts with those raw materials that primarily come from farms. Certainly, two of the participants today represent kind of that food manufacturing and processing piece and packaging that you see on this middle circular graph that's in between. And then three of us represent the retailers that are there, myself, Carlos, and Kevin. And I certainly wanted to add this year, Kevin, and the food side of the retailers that represents grocery. Last year, we certainly had retail side that represented QSR and restaurants, but I felt we were missing the grocery side. And the reason why this year it was even more important for us to have grocery is we can't do this panel today without talking about COVID and the impacts of COVID in the beginning. And that'll be really the first question that I give the panelists in just a second. But the other two charts that I have reflected up here on this same page really gives the tale of two stories in our food retail environment. And the first side, on the left-hand side, is how many of us were in grocery stores at the beginning of the pandemic, and certainly we saw some empty shelves. Now, that's not me throwing stones at Kevin by any means, but the reaction of all of us as consumers was a matter of we needed to go do pantry loading. We did hoarding of the goods that we needed in our home. And so we saw empty store shelves on things like toilet paper, things like cleaning supplies, but also things like milk and dairy and meat products and other kind of food staples that we had out there. On the other side of this page, you see a graph, and this graph happens to be a graph of our business at Starbucks in China. And it represents the store closures and the retail sales drop that we saw in China at the start of the pandemic. I can tell you that in the US, our pandemic sales drop was as drastic as this graph is as well. And so when I talk to people about what happened on the restaurant side of the business, or QSR, which Carlos and I are both in, is we fell off of a cliff in the first couple of weeks of the pandemic. And many of us climbed that mountain in a different pattern, and Carlos will talk about how Chipotle did that, I'm sure. But we had to wait till customers felt comfortable coming back into our stores, until we started to light up either new technologies or get the customers trained about how we could interact with them different, because our stores were closed for a time, or our stores were not allowing people inside the doors. So therefore, new technologies and new ways of meeting our customers came about. And so those two pictures, the graph and then the picture on the left-hand side, represents the tale of two very different stories in how this industry, the food supply chain, dealt with COVID. And I just wanted to use as an example to open up our discussions today. I do want to remind you that over the next half hour or so, we're going to be talking and asking some preset questions for the panelists, but start putting in questions into the chat box. on the HOVA application. And what I'll tell you is we won't have time to get to all the questions today, I can assure you that. But between myself and the rest of the panelists and the team from USC, we'll keep going into that HOVA app and do our best over the next 24 hours to get to any questions that we might not have gotten through today. So with that, let me jump directly over to the first question. And I'm going to ask this one of all the panelists, and we'll just go down the line to the different panelists to answer that in order. The first question that I want to start out with is related to COVID, because we couldn't have this discussion without talking about that. So the past year certainly has been interesting. Never lived one like it in my 35 years in the industry. What was one major COVID-19 impact to your food supply chain, and how are you managing currently? How are you doing either with that impact or other things currently? Carlo, let me start with you.
Thank you so much, Carl. Yeah, so of course, as with anything throughout this pandemic, there are a variety of things that really hurt us. But I think the biggest one for QSR, as Carl was alluding to earlier, was the fact that customers could not be physically present at a restaurant. So, of course, we got hit really incredibly hard. The graph that Carl displays does it perfect justice. And so what we had to do is try to figure out how to explore some of our other channels like digital. So luckily, we had spent the last couple of years investing very heavily in our digital channel. And then we had also been creating our version of the drive-thru, which we call the Chipotle lane. So it's essentially a drive-thru where you order on your phone, and then you go through the drive-thru and you pick up your order within seconds. So we were very lucky to have been able to keep the sales, but the problem is our supply chain was getting pulled really, really hard, and we were getting hit with things like, the closures of meat factories, the availability of supplies for the restaurants and things of that nature. So the way that we decided to manage it was to build very, very close partnerships and start securing some of those critical materials that we needed for the restaurant, and basically prepare ourselves for what could potentially be the second wave, just so that we could maintain the sales going at the restaurant. So very, very difficult times. Obviously, as with all my colleagues here, very long hours in the months from March leading up to now. But I think just applying supply chain principles and basics to the way that we plan and the way that we replenish was critical in these activities.
Thank you, Carlos. I really appreciate that. Grace, let me pass that same question over to you.
Sure. So as Carl mentioned, a lot of you guys, including me, were pantry loading. So as a result, our sales have been really going off the roof. And in the food industry, we're used to single-digit growth, but in the first couple of months of the pandemic, some of our items have triple-digit growth. So you can imagine the challenge on the supply chain to really keep up with that demand. And the interesting thing for us is that it's not so much on the raw material side, on buying material. Actually, our CEO have called our procurement as a strategic differentiator. We're able to secure material. Our challenge really is in the manufacturing capability constraint, particularly in the US. And with that, we are having multiple things to address that. We always put our people health as number one. And that naturally puts some constraint in our operation. But with that, we are optimizing our schedule. We are recruiting a lot of people. We are also investing in third-party capability. And by the end of this year, we are catching up. By the end of this year, we will be running 24/7, and we'll have one equivalent of one additional plant running in the US just to meet the demand. So thank you a lot to all the people working around at McCormick. The power of people is always our strength. So very happy that we're able to pull that through.
Thank you, Grace. Let me pass that same question over to Kevin.
Okay, Carl, I don't take offense to that picture because I don't believe that was of one of my stores. So appreciate you took it somewhere else. There's so many things that have gone on, but what you've got to realize is we have close to 35,000 items on our store shelves at any given time. And when the manufacturers started constricting the items available, and when you have a precise amount of shelf space allocated item by item and different other things, you start running into those gaping holes that Carl showed in that first picture. And we're used to kind of fixing the schematics, as we call them, inside a grocery store about once a year, and thinking that we were going to have the capabilities to go in and adjust to what was being available from manufacturers on the fly really put us in a difficult position up and down our aisles, because one day we'd get a shipment of rice from somebody and that would be it for the month. And so they'd want to be on the shelf with that for, as long as could be. And so adjusting, and we've gone in and had to redo the shelves and redo the layouts and different other things. But we continue to be, dealing with items that manufacturers have chose to stop making to stay in stock on their better moving items, and having to adjust how we handle those products day in, day out has been a big challenge, when you can imagine, for 339 stores with a variety of shelf sets and products that are carried. But we continue to work through that. We continue to work with our manufacturers to see what they're producing to get ourselves back in stock. And the excitement we have is we might actually see some Clorox wipes for the first time in 6 months into our distribution center. And it's those little things in the grocery business that make you real happy.
Hey, Kevin, I'm going to send you $20 to go grab a couple of those Clorox wipes canisters for me. My wife will be very happy. I do think I have enough toilet paper to last me at least a year at this point, someplace in my garage. So thanks for that. Clorox wipes has been a key one. Hey, I'm going to throw that same question over to Uday.
Yeah, thank you, Carl. I think bits and pieces of everything Carlos, Grace, and Kevin mentioned resonates very well with what happened at Impossible. Just getting into COVID, as a food manufacturer, as an upcoming food manufacturer, I should call it, we were trying to service a broad range of customers that included a mix of QSRs, retail, and in general, the food service and the restaurant industry. And the biggest challenge I think that happened was, like, as QSRs and food service bared the early brunt of the COVID impact, we saw, similar to what Grace said, triple-digit growth in the plant-based meat category in retail. It was a big shock to our supply chain for an upcoming company, and I think we had to gain that supply chain flexibility very, very quickly to adjust to the high demands of retail volume and keeping, retail stores stocked. And the other piece of it is we had to quickly change over to retail and, place a big emphasis on it. We were in only a limited number of doors, and we quickly went with a national expansion in the following 3 months, right after COVID hit. And so supply chain flexibility was key. At the same time, I think the other critical aspect was the safety of our employees and safety of the so-called essential workers, like we were deemed as part of manufacturing. We were very cautious about our opening. We took a very measured approach on how we manage our manufacturing plants, which of course adds to the complexity as you're trying to flex to a different channel and trying to change to a different channel. So those are some of the things that come into mind as I think about the past 6 months or so.
Thank you, Uday. And I think all of you brought up different key points. And between Carlos and talking about demand, supply, and replenishment planning, boy, it was all over the place in a matter of like 4 weeks. And how could you predict that? All the way to Grace, you talking about, hey, you just had to put on capacity and a whole new plant basically in the matter of a year. And Kevin, in terms of just working with manufacturers to say, hey, how can you get us as much as you can get us, because the shelf needs it. And then certainly that safety of our employees. And I am so proud of this industry, because you know what, our employees go all the way from being customer facing employees, and so many of us as retailers had to install plexiglass and change all sorts of processes in our retail outlets. But the safety of our employees goes all the way back to the farms. And how many of us saw that the farm workers didn't have the right PPE? They didn't have hand sanitizer. They didn't have those things that we needed. And we as retailers and as major food manufacturers, we had to take care of our employees throughout our ecosystem, because one set of employees isn't more important than another set of employees. And I love that all those comments came up in your answers. So really proud of this industry. We certainly were on the evening news many times during the start of the pandemic in all of those nodes, whether it was factories, whether it was retail outlets, or whether it was the farm, and actually, you know, the migrant labor picking much of that produce out there in our fields. So thank you guys. Hey, we didn't want to spend our whole time on COVID for this panel. We could easily spend the whole hour, but the theme of the summit this year is about 2025 and what's our outlook for 2025. So this next question, I've asked each of the panelists to pivot a little bit to what are they doing in their portion of the food supply chain to prepare us for 2025. So I'm going to start with Uday. And Uday, how do you foresee Impossible supply chain evolving to address the immense growth of plant-based meats? I don't even know what percentage it's increased in just the last couple of years, but it's been immense. And what are some of the things that you're establishing as foundational to your operations, both manufacturing and sourcing, to set that up for new scale?
Absolutely. Thanks, Carl. So looking forward post-COVID, we really are placing an emphasis in riding, I would say just riding the wave of this immense growth that we are seeing in the plant-based meats category. And overall, I wouldn't say we are completely out of COVID as yet, but as part of this recovery, we are seeing the retail channels and our food service channels recovering remarkably over here. And so we're setting the groundwork to establish a few things over here as we are looking at our future supply chain design. One is operational foundations. And this really includes, you know, as a smaller company, this really includes setting up the right people, the right functions, the right systems and data analytics in place, which some of the more established food manufacturers have, which currently we are, let's just say, developing or in developmental stages. The second one is redundancy, supply redundancy and capital investments over there. This includes our strategic supply base, which is, you know, we have some ingredients over here which are really, really important for our products and will continue to be important as we extend out to more SKUs and more products, whether it's in retail or food service. Establishing the capital investments and the actual redundancy on those supply, on those basic strategic ingredients over here is going to be important for us. And then the third one I would say is we have a very aggressive product roadmap over the next 3 to 4 years. The supply chain has to evolve with that, whether it is, and you know, more recently, we've had like you know, a joint venture with OSI, who is one of our key partners over in Chicago, to establishing more such models where we can manufacture our products across the globe and also develop more capabilities in terms of servicing this product roadmap and introducing newer products into the market. So I think those are like some of the three key strategic things that we want to do to our supply chain moving forward. And I see that being the common theme for us as we are going and expanding our footprint, whether it's domestically or internationally over the next 4 to 5 years.
Thank you, Uday. And you know, certainly as a small and medium-sized enterprise that's growing super fast, there's other companies that you can learn from, the bigger companies, but you're also in a niche you know, field for sure. And so that's a great aspiration. Well done. Hey, I'm going to put it over to Kevin for this next question. Kevin, how do you see the future of supply chain in 2021 for you as a grocery retailer? And what are some of the initiatives that are getting your supply ready in your supply chain for that future?
So I think you meant to say 2025. And,
I'm sorry, you're right, I did.
You know, I went to, fortunately, we have a great group of supply chain experts in the Albertsons companies. And obviously, oftentimes we are on the receiving end of a lot of the things that they're working on in retail. But the term that came back was, how do we get faster? How do we stay connected with our variety of manufacturers? And how do we take waste out of the system? And waste to us is idle time. And you can imagine what it's been like to get trucks in and out of our facilities, to find people trucking to get product into the facilities. We've always been challenged with that. And so we had we have today a pretty cumbersome methodology to get the trucker checked in and go through the process of receiving at any of our facilities. So we're actually taking a page out of probably something that Carlos and the Chipotle group with, you know, online. And we are actually going to a phone app that drivers can actually use their phone to check in, and that we can do some things and quickly get them into the receiving dock and on their way and unloaded and, you know, back out. So we're really looking at that technology and communicating with drivers to take away inefficiency there. But probably on the bigger, broader scale is a system that we call FAR, forecasting and replenishment. Computer-assisted ordering, computer-generated ordering, that has been out there as buzzwords in the industry for some time. I'm sure there's some other retailers that are doing it. We've been on the sidelines kind of waiting for that perfect storm of all the technology coming together so that we can take our sales at the front end, translate that into what the store orders needs, then take what the store order needs are, translate that into purchase orders for manufacturers, and kind of continuous loop of forecast and replenishment, and be able to take into account weather and, you know, first of the month and changes like that that cause movement to change in our industry. And so we think we finally have corralled that. We're fortunate here in Southern California. We have all 339 of our stores are utilizing that technology right now and how we order our dairy and frozen in the stores. We're bringing online dry grocery, followed by general merchandise and HBC. Perishables is a tougher nut to crack. We'll get to that at the end, but we think that will be a tremendous benefit in terms of just-in-time inventory and keeping our stocks and our shelves in stock on the go forward.
Thank you, Kevin. And apologies for the year on that. I think I'm in annual planning mode and I keep saying 2021 internally in my company instead of thinking 5 years out. It's that time of year, as we all know. Hey, this next question is going to be for Grace. Grace, McCormick, like many other food and beverage companies, has pledged to reach a number of sustainable goals by 2025. Is COVID changing any of those plans?
So COVID actually, interestingly, shows that the strategy that we have been adopting works. So what we're doing is really just continue the pace that we're going. And Kyle, something you mentioned earlier that really resonated with me. One of the things about sustainability is it's not just about us and the people in our factory, it's really everybody in our supply chain. So in the sustainability goal, one of the things that we pledged to reach by 2025 is that 5 of our iconic raw material, we want them to be 100% sustainably sourced. So those are the black pepper, cinnamon, vanilla, you know, those are the herbs and spices that you all enjoyed. And, you know, what we have done, you know, is pretty interesting, right? The first thing that we realized is that a lot of our farmers, they have to sell, they are smallholder farmers, and they sell through middlemen. And we find out that, you know, there are a couple of issues, right? So the farmers may not be able to make as much money to be sustainable for their family. And also we find out the middlemen sometimes affect the quality. And for us, you know, it's the right thing to do to make sure our farmers can make a livelihood. So in Madagascar, we actually help the farmers set up a co-op so that we can buy directly from them. And also they cut out the middleman, and we can also provide them with farming advices. So that's one of the projects that we have done. We also find some other farmers who have already successful cooperation and they want to diversify the way with what they are already doing. And in East Timor, we actually work with a co-op that were growing coffee for Starbucks, actually. And they want to go into vanilla, and we help them to have an additional crop and to help them diversify their income stream. We also find that women is playing a very essential part in agriculture. And with that, we have a partnership with an NGO called CARE, who want to fight poverty and world hunger by working with women and girls. And what we're doing with them is really in very early stage. We want to survey on the situation of what women and girls are facing in this farming community. And we want to see how to make sure that their role is being emphasized and they can be empowered. And so for me, you know, I feel very proud that all these sustainable issues initiative obviously is good for business, right? If we don't have anything to sell, we are not in business. But we also want to make sure that everyone down the supply chain will benefit from our collective effort and our collective prosperity. And with that, we are actually awarded in the past 4 years, the #1 in sustainability by corporate, apologize, I forgot the name. In the food sector, we are #1 in sustainability index. And a lot of you may thought that Unilever is doing really well, but actually we're the #1 in food. And this doesn't really change with COVID. And actually, what's more, COVID proves that it's even more important that we make sure that our farmers will continue to be able to farm and live a good life.
Thank you, Grace. I love the fact that you're working with coffee farmers to help diversify their agricultural products, because it can't be a one horse race. You got to diversify. So that's great to hear. Hey, let's go to Carlos for this last question. And then after that, we're going to open it up to some of the audience's questions. Carlos, how is Chipotle thinking about growth over the next 5 years? And how does this impact the evolution of your supply chain going forward?
Absolutely, Carl. So we have a very aggressive growth plan. So we want to double the size of the company here in the very short term. So we have a guiding principle in Chipotle supply chain that we call food with integrity. So everything that we do in the food space has to be with very, very strong integrity foundations. And so therefore, we don't tolerate things like antibiotics, like human growth hormones, like beta agonists, things of that nature. And so, of course, that makes our supply chain very complex, very difficult, and very expensive. And so we are aware that we pay premiums, but we have a wonderful value proposition where folks still can buy an $8 burrito, but take advantage of a meal that is very nutritious and it's also very affordable. So one of the key things that we worry about as we grow this supply chain is the ability to have local sourcing and local farming. We are very concerned about the future of farming in this country. The average farmer right now is about 64 years old, right, depending on the subsegment of the industry. So we've started a series of programs like our Young Farmers program, where we award a series of grants. We help farmers get access to land, which is one of the things that we hear more often that farmers don't have the ability to obtain. But we also give them some loans, some volume, some things of that nature, so that ultimately they can develop their business and become profitable and become very sustainable. So along those lines, we build very strong partnerships with these folks, and we sometimes take losses as a result of this. So just an example of COVID, we had a particular segment of the industry where you would hear on the news that these folks were throwing away their product for lack of demand. But we were just keeping everybody whole and taking losses to keep up with our partnership. So that's something that we're very proud of. And we'll continue to build that local farming and that ability to be self-sufficient at the national level. Now, that's not to say that we still don't have some dependency on international supply chains. We still do, but we're trying to improve our local subsistence as much as we can. Now, the other very important thing, and I think Grace did a wonderful job of doing this, is we want to do this in a sustainable way. So we have a series of programs and a variety of different initiatives to make sure that everything that we do is sustainable, but also that we add technology and capabilities to things like, for example, the ability to trace from the farm all the way down to the restaurant. So we hear about it a lot, right? And we hear people working on this thing, but the reality is it's actually very difficult. It's very complicated, especially when you have really long supply chains. So we've invested a lot of time and energy in this, and we'll continue to do that as we go into 2025, because we believe this is ultimately a key differentiator to be able to communicate up and down the supply chain, and actually to address things like, and I saw a question that's coming in, address things like this bullwhip effect that we're seeing, right? The inability to balance demand and supply because of those pushes and pulls that we get, right, in response to variable events such as this one. So that's more or less where we want to focus on for the coming 5 years, Carl.
Thank you, Carlos. And yeah, you started to answer some of the questions that were in the chat box already, so appreciate that. And what I'm going to do now to the participants is I'm going to go through, we're going to have time for a few questions. And again, I'm not going to get to all of them, but we'll do our best to get to as many as we can. And then our commitment is to go in and answer after the fact in writing some of the other ones between myself and the panelists. So let's start, and you know, a number of us have mentioned farmers already. So let's start really at the source and at the beginning of our supply chain, at the farms. And a couple of these questions, Carlos started to allude to some of them, but I'm going to ask them again and read them, and ask any of the other panelists that might have some insights, and I'll give you some Starbucks insights on some of these as well. So the first question is about how can we improve the farm production, which will help our farmers to get higher profits? What are the tools needed to train our farmers to enhance the supply chain profits? Carlos shared some things about young farmer programs that Chipotle is doing. Let me share one answer to some of the things that we're doing at Starbucks around this. So we have 9 farmer support centers around the world, and they're based in origin countries where coffee is grown. So the only place in the United States that grows coffee is really Hawaii. So many of you have had Kona coffee and those kinds of things, but all the rest of our coffee other than Kona is coming from an international market. But in those 9 farmer support centers, our teams of agronomists are set up just to work with the farmers in their local regions to be able to improve their output, improve their efficiencies. And I'll tell you, our main agronomy center is based in Costa Rica. We're vertically integrated in the coffee chain because we own one farm. Out of the 380,000 farms that we deal with around the world, we own one of them. But the whole purpose of that farm is to be a development center. So we invest in really the intellectual property of developing new strains of coffee that allow for either better disease restraints. So you might have heard of coffee rust. So allow them to be immune more so to coffee rust. But even more importantly to your question is with some of the intellectual property that we've developed, and we give it away, we don't sell it, we're not like the Monsantos of the world, we give it away, is to develop a plant that has 3 times the yield per acre than a traditional coffee plant. So it's not genetic engineering. So I don't want to, get into the GMO discussion, because this intellectual property is not genetic engineering. It's taking and crossing different strains of coffee and doing that in a way for better output with less water usage and no chemicals. So no, organic coffee from that perspective. So that's one way. And therefore the farmer's making 3 times more money per acre than what they were before. And it's exactly right. It's all about the farmers being able to make a living, whether they're here in the US or internationally. Let me put it to Uday or Grace. Any other comments related to the farm production and helping our farmers get a better living out of this supply chain which they support?
I can add one more comment. The commodities that we buy, herbs and spices, tend to be grown around the equator, so they will not be from the US, very similar to the Starbucks situation. And the difference between our product and coffee is that they are really not a commodity. They're pretty small farmers. So that's why we have to start from scratch to help them build a co-op. And the reason why a co-op is important is that besides all the different benefits, we can help them certify eventually down the road to be fair trade. And we have all these other plans in the line, and that will also help farmers to gain more profits.
Thank you. Kevin, Uday, any other thoughts? Or Carlos, any additional thoughts?
So just a couple of extra things. So this concept of partnering with your suppliers all the way down through the supply chain, has worked out really well for us. I think the ability that we've had to go all the way to the farm and to see what the farmers are doing has allowed us to come up with solutions and sometimes modify the processes that we use internally and the things that we do internally so that we can take better advantage of yield or things of that nature. So for example, in our produce industry, we work very closely with our key suppliers, and we actually have somebody that's right there, like a whole office in the field, trying to find better ways to optimize our supply chain, to be able to move things in a much quicker way. So as you guys know, the Chipotle supply chain is primarily a fresh supply chain. So we literally have just a handful of days to be able to take things from the field to the restaurant. So having the ability to understand the different constraints and then applying a lot of technology like these tracing devices and things of that nature allows us to position the farmers in a way that they'll be able to better win. And I think Grace is something really brilliant, which is removing the middleman. So by us understanding the different steps of the supply chain, we've been able to remove intermediaries out of the supply chain. And of course, also great for business because we have one less hand in the pot, but also we're able to transition those profits down to the farmer and help them continue to grow.
Thanks, Carlos. I'm going to move on to the next question, which is, before we move to technology, there's a couple technology questions. I'm going to move to another one related to the farmers or to food supply. And this question is, considering the pandemic, should we rely less on other countries for food within our global food supply chain? How do we become more self-sufficient quickly? And while the panelists think about that question just a little bit, let me give a little bit of some Starbucks examples. Like Carlos had said, is in many cases, our food supply chain, especially for the short supply chains, are already domestic based in North America. So certainly some of our ingredients, if we think about beverage ingredients or other things, might have longer supply chains, and certainly coffee supply chain is a long supply chain. But for the vast majority of our food, it is a shorter supply chain. We are using US-based agricultural sources, US-based factories for many of those, and that could be because it's frozen or refrigerated, or because it's just that much better to manage a shorter supply chain based on shelf lives and things like that, like Carlos had mentioned. So I would tell you, for our supply chain in food, it is different than maybe some others in high tech and other places in the vast majority of our supply chain. Again, that might not relate to packaging or merchandise or some other things that could be internationally sourced for the most part. So when it came to the pandemic, at the beginning of March, really, when the pandemic hit North America, Starbucks had already been in the midst of pandemic for already almost 2 months, 8 weeks, because we started seeing the pandemic effects in China. We started to see the importation challenges that we were starting to have as our manufacturers in China started to not hit production outputs. It really all started just before Chinese New Year. And many of you know Chinese New Year actually, shuts down China for quite a bit of the time anyways. So we were already starting to react to those longer term supply chains and changing some things up. And that was mostly related to some packaging items and some merchandise items and those things. Interestingly enough, then where we had to help China out was China's the main manufacturer of PPE for the world, personal protective equipment. So whether it was masks or shields or gloves or anything like that. So all of a sudden, all the sources in China were sold out. We ended up having to ship PPE back to China from the US and find sources of second buy PPE from distributors and from inventories here in the US and move it back the other way, which was an interesting thing that many of us didn't think we'd be doing. And frankly, also setting up PPE supply chains, because that's not something I had ever bought for my company before. We certainly had bought chemicals and other things, but never that. So we're pivoting, doing some of the things that Carlos said in terms of growing our products closer. A lot of work being done today around urban farming, multi-level farming, indoor farming. Those types of things are happening like crazy. So, a lot of efforts going on there, and hopefully I've mentioned a few. Any of the other panelists, some thoughts related to farming coming closer or food manufacturers coming closer to the US?
I think,
I can go ahead, Grace.
Uday, you should go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I think, Carl, very much like the way you spoke about your experience with the short supply chain, we see the same even in our industry. And part of it, of course, has to do with the fact that we're dealing with a cold chain over here. We're dealing with refrigerated products. And so manufacturing for us has been US based. Some of our strategic ingredients do get sourced in a more global manner, and we will continue to rely on that. And we started seeing some of the early effects of the pandemic in China, and we had to come up with a few risk mitigation plans around it. But in my industry in particular, scaling is really, really important. And I think scaling at a global level almost means that like we are looking at more and more options around how do we sustainably source ingredients across the globe, right? And so, as I mentioned earlier, supply redundancy is a big piece of the puzzle that we need to solve for, or were it impossible. And so I don't see us, at least on the long supply chain, I like the way you put that, I don't see us immediately, moving forward with just a domestic only strategy over there. We need to continue down the path of like how we can actually maintain our supply continuity. How do we ensure that we can scale to where we need to scale? And in order to do that, I think a global supply chain, a global food supply chain is necessary, at least in the plant-based space.
Thanks, Uday. Grace?
Oh, I was just trying to say that McCormick experience is pretty similar to Starbucks, where most of our material, if they can be locally sourced, they are locally sourced. And some of the materials that only grow in certain parts of the world, we have to rely on that. And similar to Uday, that's really not really going to change. It's more a matter of diversification that have more areas growing that. But some of the characteristics of food makes it hard to make it local for our portfolio.
Yeah, I have one more thing, Carl, if you don't mind. So,
Yes.
so I think this is a question of continuity of supply as well as risk mitigation and redundancy, as Uday alluded to earlier. And I think one of the key things is if you can get it locally, as you said, by all means get it locally. And I think there's still a ton of room to continue to develop our local supply chains. So that's the reason why we're investing so heavily in this. Now, I think there's a couple of things that we as an industry still need to tackle. The first one is labor and making these jobs, especially farming jobs, appealing for younger generations, right? So I remember when I was growing up in South America, all the farmers were young folks, right? And there was always an incentive for them to have their own farm and continue to develop that and so on. But the reality is we're not there in the US right now. And so whether it's through more access to land, through more availability of automation so that farmers can be more self-sufficient and also profitable, as Grace was alluding to earlier, that's going to be key, right? And so until we address that, it's going to be very difficult to continue to develop the supply chain internally. But also there's a few very key resources that we also need to address, such as water, right? So many of our crops are very water intensive. And so if we don't have good solutions to address the water issue that we're facing in the United States, then it's going to be very difficult to continue to grow the local sourcing program. So that's ultimately what we try to tackle.
Carlos, thank you for that. And I think that those things are things that are on all of our minds as food supply chain professionals. This next question is going to be related to technology. And I'm going to pass it over to Kevin for some comments first, because Kevin certainly alluded to some of the huge investments that his companies were making around technology implementations. But this question is, do you think new technologies or operations strategies help to alleviate the bullwhip effect throughout the supply chain, sudden increase and decreases in demand? If so, what are they? And let me put it to Kevin. He can reiterate some of the comments that he made and add some addition. And then a few of the rest of us can talk a little bit about this supply-demand balancing challenge that we certainly lived through COVID and learned a lot of things about, I'm sure. Kevin, any additional thoughts on that?
But I think what was so critical is that many of us operate in a just-in-time, we're watch our working capital. We want to see an increase in inventory turns, different metrics that we're measured by. And so when this bullwhip happens, that's when you find yourself, how fast can you respond? And if you take it all the way back to, the farmer or just anybody supplying raw materials and then getting that into a plant. And so many manufacturers are running plants at full capacity because they're trying to minimize the cost and investment in plants. So when a surge in demand comes up, they're not ready to handle it. And I think that was one of the greatest, learnings that came out of the early times in COVID. They just couldn't produce what the consumer demand was. And I often liken this to, people talk to me often about lines in a grocery store. And if I could have an appointment for everybody to tell them when to come to the store, we could check them out more efficiently. And if I could have a crystal ball that I knew today in Southern California, it wasn't going to be a fall 75, but 95. So that means ice is going to go up in demand and water is going to go up in demand and the various things. It's just very, challenging. But the more we build algorithms and build in history to understand what happens if this, the first of the month, what happens in this category, in this commodity, what do we need? If the weather is going to change, we look out 2 weeks. What are we going to need? Can we get it into the supply chain and out to the stores fast enough for when the demand comes from the consumer? I think that's what we're all looking for, is to take historical data to be able to anticipate what's coming down, while at the same time minimizing our inventory costs, minimizing our working capital, and some of the metrics that we get reviewed on.
Kevin, that was a perfect answer. And as I was listening to you, you were talking not only about the technology, but also, about the capacity. So the reality is that the two things happened in the pandemic. Is one was, demand was fluctuating all over the place. But my theory to you would be that we would not, with any technology, we would not have been able to plan for the demand shifts that happened in the month of March with any technology out there. Because whether it was Kevin having his shelves wiped out and manufacturers didn't have instantaneous capacity to produce enough, it was just impossible. And we could not afford as an industry to just have idle capacity sitting there ready to crank it up when it moved hundreds of percents in some cases. I don't know what toilet paper went up, but it went up tremendously. Grace talked about it. So there's the capacity planning piece, which is infrastructure, brick and mortar. And then there's the technology piece. So I can tell you at Starbucks, literally in a matter of 12 days, our demand dropped by 70%, 70%. And I couldn't stop the inbound capacity fast enough. So there was trucks on the road, there was things in my warehouses already. We couldn't stop it fast enough because we do supply planning and we have cycles and things like that. So we had to all of a sudden, slow the horses way down. And then as it started to pick up, not at a 70% in 12 days again, but at 5 and 10% week on week, month on month. And that was more predictable. I would tell you that we learned a lot about what I call integrated business planning. So how do we make sure that supply chain is so closely tied in with customer insights, with what exactly do we think our customers are going to do? Because a forecast is always going to be wrong. But to Kevin's point, we used historical. We certainly are using AI and ML learning far more than we ever did in building those algorithms. But we wouldn't have been able to predict a 70% drop in demand in 12 days. No one in their right mind would have been able to do that, in my opinion. Carlos, any thoughts related to that?
Yeah, I'll tell you, I 100% in agreement. There's one tiny little thing where I disagree, and I'll tell you what it is. I was trained as an industrial engineer. So one of our big mantras was be lean, right? As lean as possible. So take cost out, maximum utilization of the factories, no inventories, things of that nature. And so that's one of the things that I've had to revisit in the last few days as a result of COVID. You have to be lean and then also be responsible in the way that you manage your supply chain. So for example, with inventories, man, I have a friend that says that inventories are normally undesirable when you have too many, but man, do they make problems go away, right? And so when you have certain amounts of inventory, that certainly helps. Now, Kevin's absolutely right. We can't have them so much that they're going to, cause a financial issue or have obsolescence or whatever it might be. But being conservative in the way that you plan, for example, for inventories, very helpful, but also in the way that you utilize capacity. So maybe 100% utilization, maybe that's not the right thing. Maybe you always should think of having idle capacity. And I've worked with many of the folks right on this call, and one of the things that I've always advocated is don't go to 100% because you're just asking for trouble, right? An asset will go down, a truck will break down, or something will happen, and you'll have an issue. So I think lately, maybe it's the gray hair on the side of my head here, but I've been more conservative in the way that I plan my supply chain and my inventory.
I would absolutely agree with that, Carlos. I think we all are looking at safety stock. We're all looking at what's the proper utilization metrics. It's certainly not 100. Is it 90? Is it 85? Is it 75? And instantaneous capacity. So we certainly learned a lot of us from those things, and it's I have more gray hairs because I'm older than you are, Carlos. But from that standpoint, we all learned it together.
I certainly have gray hair.
Yeah. Any other panelists with any comments on that? We'll go to the last question here, and we're almost getting close to time. So this is a technology one as well, and kind of ties together a little bit. What are the new technologies being adopted in food supply chain to improve transparency for the business and consumer? And what have been the driving forces pushing new technology adoption? Carlos, you mentioned this a little bit about farm to fork technology. Maybe you or Grace might have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I can start if you guys want. So, we, for a variety of reasons, had to get really good at traceability. And so we've been investing in a series of platforms to get a lot of visibility and traceability, to the point where if for some reason we have to do a product recall, we actually now can do it in minutes, right? Like minutes, sometimes hours. So this is one of the most difficult things that I've ever had to do as a supply chain professional. It takes a lot of effort, a lot of work, a lot of technology, a lot of capital, but it's definitely something worth doing because it gives you the peace of mind that if ever something were to happen, you can react instantaneously and make sure that you're keeping, and Uday nailed it, right? Like the safety of your entire supply chain, your customers, your crew members, your partners, whoever it might be, with good visibility. So I always recommend that people, especially in our industry, spend a lot of time on this concept of traceability through advanced technology.
Thank you, Carlos. One thing that I'll share with you that we've made public at this point is from a green
I think Carl might have had any issues. There was a big weather storm in Mercer Island where he lives. He lost the power this morning. So Grace or Uday, you guys want to quickly jump in while he gets the internet connectivity back?
Yeah, absolutely. I can jump in, Grace. That's okay. I think it's a question that's really top of mind for our company right now, especially around like what we should be doing to improve like transparency of our business to our consumers. And as a company that is really focused on impact and sustainability, while at the same time providing a very tasty and nutritional product to our consumers, I think I resonate with what Carl was saying over here. Is traceability is one of the key factors that we also are taking very seriously, and we're looking at a significant amount of investments and trying to like ensure that like if there is ever issues or if we ever have to like pull the trigger, we can initiate traceability checks within, like Carl said, minutes over here. The other side of it is education of our consumer. And, this space is, plant-based meat space is an emerging space, and we are targeting meat-based customers, and we want to get over that hump of skepticism about taste and overall just nutritional benefit of a plant-based meat. And that's a big thing that we are always working on and working in the background over here, although it is not related to any form of new technologies as it stands, but it's another piece of our overall business that we are working towards.
Thank you, Uday. Grace, last word for you on that subject?
No, I think the panelists have done a great job. I don't have anything else to add.
Okay. All right. So, guys, so this is a perfect time to segue. So first and foremost, behalf of USC Marshall School of Business, the Center for Global Supply Chain Management, I want to thank you. And there is Carl. So Carl, I stepped in just
Thank you very much. I was watching on my iPhone, and we had a power surge, and it kicked me off the internet. Like I said, we have about 50-mile-an-hour winds hitting up here, and I saw the lights flicker, and then boom, 2 seconds later, I was talking to myself. So, hey, I know Uday picked up where I left off, and thank you, Nick, for stepping in. Everybody have a great afternoon, and we had a fantastic panel, and thank you so much for participating. Thank you, panelists.
So Carl, I want to thank you. Uday, Grace, Kevin, Carlos, thank you very much. Appreciate it. And I hope you guys continue to stay engaged, because one of the things we're going to make an announcement tomorrow, that as you guys know, during the COVID, we launched the healthcare initiative. The colleague from our department, Dasu, and I, along with other colleagues from other universities and policies and the businesses, we had amazing success with the healthcare initiative. We really think that we can augment our work that we did post-COVID on the healthcare into the food supply chain. Because the fact of the matter is, this is huge. You know, they say in Texas, you don't mess with few things. And I think you certainly don't want to mess with people's food, right? The moment mom gets kids hungry on the table and there's no food, we can have a huge issue. Mm-hmm. So I think tomorrow we'll be talking more about it. But thank you again, guys. Appreciate it greatly. And thanks again. Carl, hopefully the weather betters out for you a little bit.
We'll hang in there. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.